This is part 3 of Mastering Contingencies. Today we're going to talk about cancellation of a contract on the basis of a contingency. Under contract law, a contingency provides a party with the contract the ability to condition performance on the occurrence or non-occurrence of another event. For example, a buyer may condition performance under a real estate purchase contract on the outcome of the buyer's inspection. The buyer is dissatisfied with the result of the inspection, then the buyer may cancel the contract without being held in breach of contract. Another common example, the buyer under a real estate purchase contract may condition performance on obtaining a specific loan, such as not to exceed 5.5 fixed rate and not to exceed 1 point. After making a good faith effort to obtain such a loan, if the buyer is not approved for such a loan, then the buyer may cancel the agreement without being held in breach of contract. A buyer of vacant land may want a contingency on city approval of building plans. So we will start with part 3. May a buyer cancel their purchase agreement on the basis of an open contingency? An open contingency gives a buyer the right to cancel based upon the happening or occurrence of a certain event. The event doesn't happen, the buyer is not obligated to buy. The buyer may then cancel. The cancellation is not a breach because the buyer has a contractual right to cancel. Paragraph 14 of the RPA-CA specifically allows the buyer may cancel the agreement based upon various contingencies. Does a contingency give a buyer unlimited right to cancel? No, it's important to understand that a contingency does not give a buyer an unlimited right to cancel for any reason at all. Example, if a buyer cancels on the basis of an inspection contingency, the reason for canceling must be related to the matter or to a matter affecting the condition of the property and must be in good faith. Whenever a buyer cancels on the basis of the contingency, the reason for the cancellation must relate to that contingency and must be in good faith. Furthermore, a buyer cannot cause his or own contingency to fail. This is in fact one definition of bad faith. Example, if the buyer makes no effort to provide the lender with the proper information required for a loan, the buyer will not be able to obtain the loan. If the buyer then cancels on the basis of the loan contingency, this would likely be a breach since the buyer's own actions cause the contingency to fail. This would be both a breach of the contract's requirement, paragraph 3J2, that the buyer make a diligent effort to obtain the designated loan and use of a contingency in bad faith. Lastly, a buyer cannot cancel on the basis of a contingency if the contingency has been satisfied. Let's take an example where the buyer has removed all contingencies with the exception of the loan contingency. Suppose the lender approves the loan that the buyer was seeking, but the buyer chooses not to accept it. Can the buyer cancel on the basis of the loan contingency? No, the buyer actually was able to obtain the loan and therefore the contingency has been satisfied. In this example, the buyer's cancellation would be a breach. Under what circumstances may a buyer cancel based upon the appraisal contingency? The RPA states that the contract is contingent upon a written appraisal by a licensed or certified appraiser of the property at no less than the specified purchase price. This is found item 3I of the RPA. You'll see right there, says this agreement is or is not. If you leave it unchecked, then it's in place by default. Contingent upon written appraisal of the property by a licensed or certified appraiser at no less than the purchase price. Buyer shall, as specified in 14B3, in terms of writing, remove appraisal contingency or cancel the agreement after 17 days by default. If the property doesn't appraise at the purchase price, then the buyer may cancel based upon this appraisal contingency, and the buyer would be entitled to return of the deposit. Good faith generally doesn't come into play here since the buyer has little control over the appraiser or appraisal process. If the appraisal comes in low, the buyer simply has a right to cancel. Of course, if the buyer did improperly influence the appraiser to obtain a low appraisal in order that the buyer may cancel, then this could qualify as bad faith on the part of the buyer. In such circumstances, the buyer's cancellation would likely be a breach. Under what circumstances may a buyer cancel based upon the loan contingency? The RPA specifically states that the buyer shall act diligently and in good faith to obtain the designated loan or loans. So using the example from the introductory paragraph where the buyer was to obtain a loan not to exceed 5.5 fixed rate and not to exceed 1 point, if a buyer, after making a good faith and diligent effort to obtain such a loan, is not approved, then the buyer may cancel the agreement without being held in breach of contract. What does it mean in this context to make a good faith and diligent effort? The answer is not always going to be clear. Examples of possible bad faith. Buyer has not provided a complete loan application after being asked for one. Buyer has lied to the lender. Buyer has intentionally failed to provide requested documents to the lender. If the buyer engaged in any of those actions, then the cancellation based upon the loan contingency may be a breach of contract. Another example of failure to act diligent and in good faith to obtain the designated loan is where the buyer never sought to obtain a loan at 5.5%. Let's say the buyer only sought out loans at 3%. Clearly then, the buyer could not cancel on the basis of the loan contingency because they never made any effort at all to obtain the designated loan. Should the financing section of, should the financing section indicating the interest rate and points be filled out? An important part of the loan contingency pertains to the buyer making a good faith and diligent effort to obtain the designated loan or loans. This protects the buyer by making it clearer exactly what type of loan the buyer should be trying to obtain. When the contract is specific, then the buyer will be able to cancel with greater confidence if they are unable to obtain the loan. If the section is left blank, then it will be unclear when the buyer may use the loan contingency to cancel. This does it mean that the buyer must take any loan they are offered, no matter how bad, in order to cancel on the basis of the contingency? Or does it mean the buyer need only make a diligent effort to obtain any reasonably priced loan? When the financing portion of page 1 of the RPA is left blank, it is unclear. The failure to fill out the section can lead to unnecessary dispute. So here we have the first page of the RPA, D and the loans. You would specify what type of loan it is going to be. You would specify the rate not to exceed a certain percent. And you would specify the points being charged not to exceed a specific amount. The buyer is offered a loan on the terms as designated in the RPA-CA, but then objects to other terms, such as a prepayment penalty. Can the buyer cancel? The answer depends. In the case of Robertson versus Dodson, a judge stated that when an agreement to sell real property is silent on the details of the terms of the financing, the usual and standard terms of a note and deed and trust must be accepted by the buyer. Specifically, in that case, the judge stated that the buyer had no right to reject a loan on the basis that the note contained an acceleration clause. However, the judge speculated that the buyer might be able to reject a note on the basis of compound interest, since that custom or usage was not well known to the community. So the answer here is that it may be possible for a buyer to reject financing because of certain terms and then cancel on the basis of a loan contingency if the terms are not common terms of a typical mortgage. But it is not clear what terms might fit within that definition. If a buyer would like to reject a loan based on certain provisions, such as prepayment penalty, and then cancel on the basis of the loan contingency, the agent should advise the client to speak to an attorney. What exactly is the rule for cancellation based upon an inspection contingency? The inspection contingency is the broadest contingency. As outlined in paragraph 10 of the residential purchase agreement, it includes a wide range of types of inspections. Moreover, the incorporation of the buyer's inspection advisory into paragraph 10 further broadens the scope of the inspection contingency. What makes the inspection contingency especially broad is that both the law and the contract give the buyer wide latitude to exercise the inspection contingency based upon good faith assessment of the condition and any other matter affecting the property. Indeed, case law expands a buyer's rights even further by allowing that the buyer may exercise contingency and cancel the contract based upon the buyer's own subjective standard of which conditions are satisfactory and which are not. Nonetheless, there is still the limiting factor that any buyer's decision to cancel must always be in good faith, meaning that the buyer's reason for cancellation must genuinely be based upon either the condition of the property or some other matter affecting the property. Specific examples of what might constitute a proper reason for canceling under an inspection contingency. As previously discussed, the buyer can cancel based upon an inspection contingency for any reason in which they are truly dissatisfied. Examples of possible reasons for cancellation: pest inspection that comes back indicating Section 1 work must be done. The Megan's Law database shows a sex offender living nearby. The roof needs repair work. Best practice: if at all possible, the buyer should not rely upon a single factor as a reason for canceling under the inspection contingency. Generally, most buyers have more than one reason for not liking a property, and the cases that discuss inspection contingencies mention a multiplicity of factors that must be considered when evaluating a broad inspection contingency. So it is best for the buyer to not focus on any single factor as the basis for their dissatisfaction. However, if there is clearly a single overriding factor, don't worry. Buyer's cancellation will still be proper as long as the buyer is genuinely and in good faith dissatisfied. Is the buyer required to specifically state the reason for the cancellation at the time of cancellation? This is actually a question that comes up quite often. For me, the buyers or the agent feel compelled to give a reason as to why they are canceling the contract, but really it is not necessary. So nowhere in the contract or law is the buyer required to immediately state the exact reasons they are canceling. Therefore, if the buyer wishes to cancel on the basis of an inspection contingency, then the buyer can indicate as the reason for the cancellation paragraphs 12 and 14 of the RPA-CA, which reference the buyer's right to cancel without going into specifics. Form cancellation of contract, or Form CC, may be used for this purpose. So this is what I usually recommend, is if you're doing a cancellation or really any sort of modification to a contract, you're going to reference the specific area of the contract and just say, we are canceling, we're exercising our rights to cancel per paragraphs 12 and 14 of the RPA-CA. That's really all you need to say. Ultimately, however, the buyer should have his or her reasons. If there is a dispute over the deposit, then a mediator, arbitrator, or judge may demand to know why the buyer canceled, and the buyer should then be able to fully explain his or her reasons. Is the buyer guaranteed to get the deposit back when he or she properly canceled the contract in good faith based on the contingencies? No. Keep in mind that if there is a dispute over the deposit, there's a good chance that a judge in small claims court or arbitrator will make the determination as to who is in the right and who is in the wrong. Small claims court judges are not necessarily knowledgeable about real property or contract law, and even if they are, they might not care too strictly to adhere to the law, either depending on their sympathies or the particular facts of the case. Also, it's quite possible that the judge just might decide that the buyer's reasons are in fact in bad faith simply because the judge does not believe the buyer's testimony. Best practice: do not provide assurances to your client that they will receive the deposit back. You may explain that under the terms of the contract, the buyer has broad inspection contingency rights and that they may be entitled to the return of the deposit when those rights are exercised in good faith. But ultimately, if there is a dispute, a judge or arbitrator may decide the issue, and no one can ever guarantee how any particular case will be decided. One only has to look at the many high-profile court cases to see that decisions do not always go the expected way. Always work towards a solution. And as they say in UFC, if you're a fan of the UFC, never leave it in the hands of the judges. So if you have a dispute between anything going on with the contract, cancellation, the earnest money, the earnest monies tend to be in dispute quite often, even if it's pretty clear cut with the contract. Always work towards a solution and don't leave it in the hands of the judges or the arbitrator. That concludes the three-part series for contingencies. Stay tuned for additional trainings.